Okay, this video is designed to help you with the interpretation. So this is the bit where we look at the historian. So this is AO3. The source stuff was AO2 and your timeline over time is AO1. So for AO3, to get 10 out of 10 for this, you're looking at being able to show a very good understanding of why the historians are writing in the way that they are. And that will come from the research you've done looking at their backgrounds, the quality of their writing, their access to sources, what viewpoint they're taking from their books. So, for example, Paula Bartley, when we researched how to find out about historians in a previous video, we looked at how Bartley used her sources very well and focused very much on Emily Pankhurst. Yet that book in particular will not tell you about other kind of leading individuals or perhaps point a negative line towards Emily Pankhurst. So therefore, her interpretation is going to be quite one-sided perhaps, or heavily looking at the character of her. That's because the nature of her investigation. You'll need to get that across in two ways. One, to talk about interpretations after your introduction. So the moment you've started your first piece, the next section that will come after your introduction will be the analysis of your two key historians. You need to do two things. One, talk about your first historian. Two, talk about the work that they have, their key work. And then three, start to assess their values and limitations. Second of all, you then need to compare those historians a little bit to talk about maybe the differences between these two. And then the final thing is to look at how the historians can be embedded within the essay itself. So you'll start by analysing them quite quickly, straight after your intro. After you've done your analysis, the next part of your essay will be looking at how you write the very first point, and then you get cracking with that, and you might put your first source in. But what I want to try and do is show you how you come back to the historian time and time again. So the idea is that you come back to their opinion and say whether that point that you're trying to make is challenging their interpretation or supporting it. Okay, first of all, let's have a look at this. This is the first bit, and let's use a blue for this one. The section here starts off by talking about the first historian. It clearly labels who that first historian is, and then it goes on to talk about the fact that they are a professor, where they are professing, and then their viewpoint. So Carson conveys the view that, and then they've got a quote from this particular historian. So they've got who this historian is, where they're working at, what they're currently working on, and then what their key view is. Now, this person's then gone on to say what this suggests. This suggests that Martin Luther King should be seen as the face of the movement, however, not the driving force, and certainly not the most significant individual. That is a nice link to the question. It's in Carson's book, so we're talking about the title of the book, which comes up next. That's there. He explores King's family and so on. Carson worked closely with King, acknowledging both successes and failures. This adds value. So this is valuable, convincing perhaps, because it provides a balanced argument. However, it's limited due to the fact that Carson had a very close relationship with King that was different to what the general public would have seen. This may have influenced his view. So a nice, great, off the bat, straight away assessment there. Just so that we've got that drawn out. That's our first stage here. Stage one, historian and where they are. Stage two, that's their viewpoint. Stage three, mention the book, perhaps use a quote. And then stage four of this is then assessing the value and the reliability of it. Next, we go on to the next part, which is a bit of background. Carson grew up in a southern state in Mexico where racism was most apparent, and there was a minority of African-American families. It was an experience that led Carson to become involved with the civil rights movement. So we've got a background, and this explains how he's involved as well. We talk about the 1960s. He was writing his doctoral dissertation on Stokely Carmichael at the time. And then once we've got a bit of examples of the stuff that he's done in his life and the books that he's written, we've got what this reveals. This example of his academic background gives his view value as he studied the movement in depth at a prestigious university. He uses reliable sources and he's recognised worldwide. So that's the next element. Carson joined the SNCC, so there's a bit more context here. His first-hand experiences of being within the movement means that it limits Carson's value because he was an active member of the movement there and then. And then the next thing that we can see here, they're starting to talk about their second historian, Adam Fairclough. From that example that we've just looked at, here is our here we've got kind of, I suppose, the next example of what I'm trying to show you, stage 5, which is how the history of the historian, what they've done in their life, how that's impacted upon them. Perhaps if you're doing anti-Semitism, you could talk about the impact that would have if they were Jewish, perhaps, or if they were there at the time, or if they were writing perhaps in a modern context. Maybe you could talk about the works that they've done. Maybe talk about some of the other histories that they've written, other books that they've done. Maybe that adds to the volume and the prestige of this historian and explains why they're so good, or perhaps why they're so limited. So that there gives you an example of that assessment of the historian. And the next slide, I'm going to have a look at how we embed it into the answer. Right, so here we've moved on to the first point, which is looking at King, the value of King as an individual. What I want to do is just show you a small example of how this is tied back into the argument. So right at the top of the page, it says, contrasting King's march on Washington also showcases his limitations as an influential leader. Notice we've talked about, so Fairclough was the second historian that we didn't look at in the previous slide. Fairclough, who usually champions King, comments that the march overall did little to spur the government. Notice the footnote there, because that's a direct quote from Fairclough's book, and that'll be at the bottom of this page. Now we're explaining why that's relevant. So this suggests that King's work was largely based on creating a reaction from the public. So this suggests that his work was largely blah, 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 blah. Carson argues, look at how they dropped that in, says as our first historian, that King's charismatic qualities distorts his actual considerable contribution and places a false facade. Both of these are therefore suggesting that King was not largely, the responsible for the greatness that came out of that march on Washington. King was known to use the work of other individuals to create a public profile for himself. So this bit here is the views of the student, views of the student. The march on Washington was taken from the ideas of Randolph, and like Birmingham, nothing was left for chance. It was immensely planned. A brilliant little comment there where two historians have been thrown in there with some quotes from those historians. If we look a little bit further down, they then start to work on an additional point. The work of other individuals also made an impact on the movement. So this is coming back to, this is a nice little link to the question, returning back to the point. But what I'm trying to show you there is that you should be referring to your historians throughout with comments like this. A quote from the historian maybe, or a view that the historian would have supported this or disapproved of this, and then how that relates to your point overall. That's just melded in quite nicely. Nice little example to finish off, and hopefully this video therefore gives you an overview of how the interpretations can be worked on in your essay. Thanks.